Welcome to the SMPT podcast. My name is Richey, and I want to thank you for being here today. And for those of you who saw on my Instagram stories that we were doing a countdown leading up to this particular conversation about Pilates and research with somebody very special to me. Dr. Rebecca Hess is joining us today, and I want to introduce her a little bit and tell you about why she's special to me before I let her introduce herself. And I want to express my appreciation and my gratitude for you, Dr. Hess, because she was in charge of all the research classes I took when I was going through my doctoral program at CalU, and she was kind and stern and loving and supportive and everything that you wish that you had from a teacher. So thank you for that. And at times, let's be honest, a little bit scary. And I appreciate you for every bit of it. At graduation, you were the most loving, interested, supportive, and proud person when I showed up there. So thank you so much for everything that you've done for me and numerous other students throughout your teaching career. I appreciate that. I'm so happy to have you on the show. Please introduce yourself and let people know a little bit about who you are.
Thanks, Rick. It's always a delight to work with students in research. I have spent most of my career doing that. Working with students on research as opposed to doing research of my own or with other colleagues is really most interesting to me because I think it's naturally developing curiosity. So if I can help cultivate curiosity, that's what it's all about. For me, I've been teaching in the health and exercise sciences for an awful long time, over 40 years. So
there you go.
So yeah, I have a crossed background in dance and also a little bit of, but I was always interested, even when I was dancing or teaching dance, in the science of movement. So that was what just kept propelling me through to my PhD. So which ultimately was in motor learning and motor control. So that's how I've gotten to where I am, and I'm interested in talking to you guys not only about research for the fitness professional, but how that best fits for the fitness professional.
Oh, I love that. And listen, I've always said that dance is what happens when Pilates stands up. So I think that's why there's so many dancers that end up going into Pilates and they become teachers and instructors or at least class participants in it because somehow it seems very familiar to them.
Yes, and if you had grown up in the time frame that I did, all of us grew up as modern dancers using Graham technique, Martha Graham. Mm-hmm. And she worked with Joe Pilates. They shared students as well as with Balanchine in New York City there. So the studios were all very close to one another. And when the dancers were injured, they were sent to Joe or Uncle Joe. And when I first started training in Pilates, it never really dawned on me that a lot of our techniques that we use in modern dance have Pilates basis to them. So I ended up serving on the certification commission for the Pilates certified instructor. And from there, I was kind of sourced out by the executive director, a wonderful woman, Elizabeth Anderson of the Pilates Method Alliance. She wanted to put together a research initiative, and this was in 2016. So in 2016, we launched it with a dual keynote speak with a woman who had been fostering research there as a physical therapist, Sherry Betts, who did a phenomenal job for a long time on her own promoting research in Pilates. And since then, we have developed a full-blown research committee for the Pilates Method Alliance, known as PMA.
Oh, PMA Pilates Method Alliance, and then one of my friend's books, The PMA Effect, also Positive Mental Attitude. I'm loving everything about this conversation so far, so thank you very much. I want to get into a little bit about some of the research in Pilates. And are you finding that, there are these initial ideas of what Pilates was doing, and now we've got some research. So have you found that the research, how much does it support what those original ideas were? And then are there any things that you're like, well, this is traditionally what was taught, but the research is kind of pulling us in a different direction, or it makes us think a different way?
Yes. I always refer to research that we wish it would tell us as cardiac research.
Yeah.
Remember, as a student, I would say, be careful about meddling with your searching and your research in terms of how you feel. So you have to keep that very objective. Yes, I did in 2016 when I presented for them, and since then several sessions, I've really gotten a lot more into the Pilates research, and we know several things. One is that Pilates is extremely effective on changing quality of life. And
Okay.
this is, when you think about it, this is vitally important across the lifespan, especially even in a time now where our spirits and our emotions are tested. And so having these avenues in this particular training method that really focuses on mind body, it is
Yeah.
a type of somatic practice. So also we know that there are some very interesting results for low back pain, but pain is one of those issues that is so nebulous that
It
it's
is.
hard to get a handle on what the research is telling. However, I just did a newsletter for the PMA, in an upcoming newsletter, looking at a really nice, high quality systematic review and meta-analysis, which was looking at the effects of Pilates compared to control, meaning no additional treatment, and Pilates compared to other forms of balance training. So they were looking at the effects of Pilates on balance and falls in the older adult. This is something that Pilates has been very up on in terms of following the client through their lifespan and what Pilates is really manifesting in the body. This was a very interesting review because their procedures and methods were very, very well done. And what they found was that there is a moderately significant effect for Pilates, favoring Pilates in terms of comparing it to a control, high effect for overall balance. And so this is very, very interesting finding when we start to see these higher levels of evidence tell us, looking at over 400 and some people, 15
wow.
randomized. These were randomized controlled trials that they were reviewing. So again, high level of evidence. But I do want to talk a little bit about level of evidence.
I do too. Yes, yes, yes. So look, let's get into this because there are so many things about this that going through your coursework, not only was level of evidence important, source that level of evidence was published in. And I know in previous times, I would just say, hey, this is in, I don't know, Google Scholar, right? Or this is published in PubMed. It didn't matter which publication it was in, it was just published and reviewed, so it must be good. But there are numerous caveats in that, and those are some things that I'd like to explore with you, because we know that that level of evidence and the presentation of that evidence and who publishes it can have a significant effect on the validity of that.
Yeah. When I talk to the Pilates instructors, the certified Pilates instructors, as well as other fitness professionals, I always start with reminding them that you're a researcher, whether you think you are or not. You're also a consumer of research because you apply the evidence by using recommendations in position statements, consensus statements, wherever you're gaining this from, you are using research. But when we look at level of evidence, we want to remind ourselves that, and I also want to come back to credibility. So you kind of got my mind split into two ways. So I do want to address level of evidence, because basically what we know is you have to be comparing something to something else. And it also needs to be done in a rather random and systematic manner, to make a long story short. So based on a pyramid, we see that the strength of the evidence goes up, and the potential bias of the evidence goes down the higher to the top of the pyramid we climb, which is where the systematic reviews and meta-analyses are, followed underneath by randomly controlled trials. But there is also something else we have to factor into the equation, and that's quality of the research, which we probably need to come to at some point. Because a lot of people, especially in my sports nutrition class, we see position statements that were based on meta-analyses and systematic reviews argued quite often, because they'll come back in and look at the methodology and go, hey, in reducing the literature that you reviewed, there might have been bias here, here, and here.
Interesting.
So it's kind of on the fitness professional to no longer say, I don't know anything about research. Educate yourself, because you are, if nothing else, you're a consumer of research. Credibility is the other thing that you talked about. So when we talk about credibility, that's where I teach a graduate research course to wellness coaches and health and wellness coaches. And one of the things that I spend the most amount of time on is, are you using credible sources? Two quick ways to determine that, and you mentioned them. One is looking at the authors and where the authors are located. Who are they and who are they affiliated with? Always safe bets are those people affiliated with universities that have no conflict of interest. And the second ones are to use your professional associations, especially our very preferred professional associations for certain materials. NASM, ACSM, NATA, NSCA, all rate very, very high in terms of accruing evidence and reporting them in large consensus and position statements.
So I have a question for you based on that, because, it's probably fair. It's a fair question to ask, but a lot of times people will say, a desire for companies like NASM is to be able to be profitable enough to help fund research. That's like a goal. But the problem inherently is, once we fund research and we get information back, then people go, we can't trust that because you funded the research. How do we get around that?
I've seen this earlier in Gatorade, because the Gatorade Institute pumps out phenomenal information that I still use in my advanced sports nutrition courses, because it is very good evidence. Also, I am seeing that ACE is now struggling with this, because they are again engaged in the research process, and just like you say, they're funding it as well. There has to be a disclaimer. So once an association goes into funding, I still think that is valid practice, because somebody's got to fund it.
Right.
So, and in educational research, we have no money. So when we see larger associations come up and say, hey, especially like Gatorade, we'll fund this, we'll look at, exertional heat illnesses, we'll look at dehydration, then we should all be very grateful that is happening. But they have to disclaim somewhere that they are not only reporting the evidence that is found. Also, if you think about it, NASM, ACE, the Gatorade Institute really doesn't have anything that they need to support in favoring them. You guys are practicing the science already. The framework, the structure of NASM was developed on the OPT model was developed from science. And Mike Clark did a beautiful job of that, right? So I think as long as an association explains to the people that they're aware of what conflict of interest is, and that the money is only being devoted to objective research, and it will be reported in either way.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thank you for clearing that up, and hopefully that is it provides something for people who are out there listening, that whether or not they had a question about it, or whether other people ask that question and they go, wait a minute, I'm not sure what's going on here. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, as we've seen multiple places throughout society right now, but there's a lot of pushback against evidence in certain ways, saying that evidence can't answer everything, or we don't have answers for everything. And there's a lot of truth to that too, because you've got to find new things to research. So where does this kind of evidence and then the things that aren't yet supported come into play, and how can we kind of stitch those together, and then of course lead into researching that in the future?
This is something that we spent a lot of time cultivating in Pilates, the research committee in particular. And we do this in talking to our instructors that are interested in doing research. If they're not affiliated with a research facility or a university or a healthcare system that can provide institutional review for them, then the safest way to develop good research is by developing a case report. Case reports, if you look at level of evidence, however, and you may remember, fall very low. That's because right. There's a lot of bias, and the strength of reporting on only a single case, or even in 2 or 3 cases or clients, only really reflects the characteristics of those clients.
Correct.
However, I'm currently working on a chapter right now for a book that's supporting the benefits of case reporting. And one of the things that I have found, and promoting it to our Pilates instructors, many of which who hold other fitness credentials, such as personal training, strength and conditioning, is that when you're conducting research every time you work with a client. If something in the practice isn't working or is working, or you have a client that presents a unique situation, perhaps you're working with somebody with scoliosis, but the scoliosis is unique in its own vacuum, or somebody who PTSD. We're seeing a lot of research generated in Pilates right now, training for or working with PTSD individuals. So I think what the person needs to be thinking about, the professional needs to be thinking about is, am I seeing something unusual? Always be questioning what you are seeing, because that's the origin of a research problem, right? And any research study or report comes out of a good problem. So to answer your question specifically, that's how we do it. The fastest and easiest way is for fitness professionals to be reporting on their cases. Fortunately, case reports are done retrospectively. They can be done prospectively, but essentially, most of the time you're reporting on something that you've already done. You do need to get consent from your client, and it has to be written and documented and stored, but it doesn't have to go through the National Institutes of Health. Okay. So it doesn't have to go through IRB, but it still has the same value of anonymity for that client, of privacy for that client, and all the other packaging that goes with institutional review, IRB.
Now, does that mean that we could put that together with basically any client we have? If we're familiar with the process, with any single client, we can basically do a case study and a case report for just our everyday practice.
Yes. Case reports are a little bit different than case studies. So I do want to clarify that. And I spend a little bit of time in my chapter talking about that. Case reports are something that you're talking about that you are doing. Typically, they come from clinical research And they are generated by something unusual, an unusual characteristic or condition or symptom of the patient or client. We've kind of adopted case reports into fitness and health care, health-related science. It's kind of manifested itself into our practice. So case studies is actually when you are planning a study, so that you develop the methodology that you're going to use to observe the case and to run the case. Meaning that you can even use, let's say I'm going to see if my Pilates training using the tower will increase curvature of the kyphotic curve or decrease a kyphotic curve in a person with kyphosis. And that could be a unique case, but I set up a priori to study it, as opposed to I've already worked with this person, this is what I found. I find it to be very interesting, like we've seen medically over the years, and then it's reported.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Then, what are some of the ways? Are you practicing as an instructor with Pilates right now, or just focusing primarily on research?
No, I do. I'm not a certified Pilates instructor. And one of the reasons why is because of my role working with the Certification Commission, which I just stepped off of this past year. So I was serving for them as a public member. And so we did review for the certification exam, which is a nationally accredited exam and done internationally. But I wanted to keep at ends with that. Because I still am dancing and I still can instruct dance. But once you get to my age, it's much more fun to go take class.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of fun working with my Pilates colleagues and learning from them, and then sharing my interest and my background in research.
Gotcha. Well, what are some of the primary things that are coming out of Pilates? And we already talked about. You mentioned pain, and you're right. Pain is so multifactorial, and there's some wonderful research out there on pain science that has been developed over the last 10 years. And here's where I stand on it, is that it is not the role of a Pilates instructor or any fitness professional to address pain. Pain may be addressed during the process of it, but not saying, hey, you're in pain, come do Pilates. It is, let me address your movement, let me address deficiencies, let me address imbalances, but it's not to address pain. And people who address pain have licensure to do so. Now, that doesn't mean that a fitness professional, a Pilates instructor, or somebody that practices any particular practice will not, in fact, mitigate pain. That may happen, but it is not our job to say, oh, you should do this because of pain. And I think we need to be very careful of that. But I do know for a fact, Pilates has been wonderfully effective at supporting people in managing pain. I believe that's why there's so many physical therapists that incorporate Pilates into what they do, because they've seen that benefit as well. And the same thing as for the fitness professional. But there is a line there that we have to be careful where we are and what we do. So if you could speak to that, and then speak to some of the things that we've seen or that you've seen, because I haven't seen it. What has Pilates done in the research that you find to be absolutely compelling?
I would start by saying 3 words, which is what I always start with when I'm talking to people about research: scope of practice. Mm-hmm. So you have to work within your scope of practice. And exactly what you say about pain, it would be the same thing about addressing mental health. There are professionals that are licensed and have the background and knowledge to work with individuals specific to pain and other mental health issues, and that is not our role. So again, maintaining your scope of practice. I've even entered into that conversation with a lot of people about nutrition. If you don't have credentials that match well, and your scope of practice is very tight in how you can recommend then you need to stick with education and the practice of what you're doing. And if the serendipity is that, like you say, is that it's beneficial, I always think that music and dance is just, it's a way to get the neuroendocrine system awake and alive. And so whatever works. I think the most interesting thing for me in Pilates research is really looking at what Joe wanted it to do and what it appears to be doing in its lifetime. He was a real fitness champion. He really believed in Pilates to develop strength, power, all of the things that are promoted by NASM. Flexibility, particularly a flexible spine. He was the epitome of it himself. And it's demonstrated in every aspect of the practice, including the breath and the control of it. That's what I see. And that's what we're starting to see in the research as the research methods get better. There's growing pains in any profession. I lived through seeing it in athletic training. Athletic training a couple of decades ago was very young to research methods. I came from motor learning, which has a rich, long World War II and past background in research. And so I would look at some of their reports and go, oh my heavens, what's going on here?
Right.
but they developed, and the PhDs came into place, and you could see the methodology firming up and becoming of higher quality. And we're just starting to see that in Pilates research. Again, a lot of the published research in Pilates is coming from the healthcare professional, people who are certified Pilates instructors, but also physical therapists, athletic trainers, physical assistants, physician assistants, chiropractors. So they have joint credentials, including certified personal trainers. So we are starting to see that Pilates can affect balance, strength, flexibility, quality of life. Those seem to be the top of the list. And this was one of the groups that Joe would have been promoting for sure.
I want to ask you a question about the balance, because I find this interesting. And if you have a few minutes, I want to add, we're going to open up and have Greg go through some of the questions that people on our Facebook Live group are asking. But I find it interesting. You talk about the benefits towards balance, and you mentioned that earlier on in our conversation. But I find it interesting because I don't know, and I may be wrong. So please inform me if I am. But it seems, at least to what I see, that Pilates doesn't tend to leave the mat very often, or at least they don't tend to stand up very often. So now something for balance that kind of correlates to, am I able to maintain my balance? But I rarely practice that in practice. So how is it studied? What's implemented, and is it mat based? And then do we find there's kind of correlation between what you do on the mat and how well you do when you're standing up?
Oh, that's a conversation that I used to have with the guys in NASM all the time. What's the correlation between practice and performance, right? I mean,
sure.
That's a huge issue in and of itself.
Right.
Well, to answer your question about mat work, you're only seeing a very small segment of Pilates. A lot of what Joe's rehabilitation work was done on Apparatus, including the reformer, which is a system of springs, towers, which are all spring-loaded. So there's a lot of spring-loaded training that is done. The primary start of the mat work, which is kind of the genesis of what we want everybody to go through, it kind of sets the stage for what you need in terms of recruiting core musculature, all the way through the core, meaning, right, the center and front and back and sides, as well as the shoulder and pelvic girdle. So developing stability there, very much like the OPT model, where we see that stability at the foundation, right?
Right.
That is exactly what Pilates mat work serves. But it is For example, I rarely use mat, and sometimes I use mat work with yoga, but I love my reformer. So I use the reformer quite a bit with other Pilates apparatus.
Gotcha. Well, I'll also say there's a whole lot easier to buy a mat than it is a reformer. It's a whole lot easier to store a mat than it is a reformer or a chair or a barrel or all the different apparatus that continue to be used. So I do get that. And NASM got that for a long time. We'd teach workshops and we would focus on, in those works, primarily stabilization training. And people would think that all we did was work with bands, like little bands. And I was like, well, that's because shipping cable systems is very expensive.
Exactly.
So we ship bands, and that's relatively cheap, and that it's supposed to represent what you can do with a band, a free weight with anything else. So I think if we're talking about this as mat work laying a foundation, and then you can then take that mat work and then sit upright and then stand upright and then apply it to many, many, many different things, then it can be wonderfully supportive. With that said, I want to go to Greg and see if, Greg, we have anything going on in our gallery there.
Yeah, active chat. I'm not 100% sure.
Can't hear you.
When you unmute your mic, it helps a lot. Sorry about that, guys. So we did have a pretty active chat today. We do have one question. I'm not 100% sure if this is in the scope, but we'll put it out there anyways. Lucas wants to know, can you talk about range of motion and activation in the leg, calf, and ankle, and how it affects the entire body?
All right. Dr. Hess, do you want to address a very broad question that seems like it's narrow, but I don't think it is?
I think it's very, very broad. I mean, when you talk about range of motion in the lower extremity, we do concentrate a lot with that in Pilates and in dance. And we know that in all athletes, there's a certain range of motion that is needed to get what we refer to as the triple extension, right? Needed for any push-off, walking, running, jumping, rebounding. There has to be effective or enough range of motion to produce the force and absorb the force. So I always think of range of motion as coming first, especially when you're looking at your potential range of motion, and then strength and power coming out of that. And we all know, of course, that there is a very soft spot where if you exploit the range of motion too far, then you're dead in the water, right? So there's that critical spot to get that stretch shortening cycle to go. In terms of how it affects the body, we did look a little bit at this. I did my postdoc in balance at the Balance Lab in Ioneer at UPMC. We did look a little bit at lower leg stability, not so much range of motion, but lower leg stiffness in the muscles. And there's a pretty strong correlation between optimal, and that's a whole other story, optimal stiffness and stability and support of the rest of the body. Because again, that's your weight bearing structures, right? But we can't underestimate what's going on in the core and the pelvic girdle. Because if we just focus on the lower extremity and we have a weak core or pelvic girdle, and particularly an unstable pelvic girdle, then the distribution of length of those muscles that all connect up into the hip and pelvis and down behind the knee, right? So we get gastrocs in there coming up from the foot. We get hamstrings and quads coming down from the hip past the knee. You can't overlook the importance of the hip.
Yeah, and I think also to add to that, something that you mentioned goes directly back to a podcast that we recently released. We talked about sliding filament theory and how that relates to the length-tension relationship. There is an optimal length at which you're going to have optimal strength. And at those end ranges of motion, you don't have quite the cross-bridging that's there. It's harder for muscles to contract from end ranges of motion. But it does not mean that we don't strengthen those end ranges of motion. And I think that's something that NASM talks about, but we probably don't bring up front enough which is active flexibility and active range of motion. So I think that that's valuable, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
I love those terms. I absolutely love those terms. Working in athletic training early on in my career, I taught athletic trainers undergrad in the undergrad ATEP program and graduate ATEP program for over 20 years. And I taught kinesiology and research. And really what we find is that if we don't develop good active range of motion, so I refer to when we stretch before we work, whether it's dynamic or passive assist with yourself, you're just gaining your potential. What's kind of there. We're not trying to increase it. We just need to kind of get to what we have. However, when we have people who have excessive range of motion, like dancers, when we bring the dancers into the athletic training room, it would make them very nervous, because we have a lot of range of motion that we're trying to develop strength and stability in those outer limits that you're talking about. So it's certainly there. And again, if we have somebody, swimmers, divers, wrestlers, dancers, that need wider ranges of flexibility, we have to train them actively throughout that range.
Yes. So. Oh, good. Well, then
injury will occur if we don't.
And that is something, if anybody's going to be attending Optima 2020, hopefully I'll be attending Optima 2020. Let's see how this pandemic works out. But I will be doing lessons. I'll be doing live seminars on active flexibility, active range of motion, and active flexibility. And I think that that's just it's part of our curriculum. It's part of what we teach, and everybody goes through it, but rarely pays attention to it. And I think the value of implementing that regularly should not be overlooked. So thank you for that. Hey, Greg, do we have any other questions that have popped up?
Yeah, one in terms of the research and evidence-based discussion that you had earlier in the show. How exactly, with the internet, the way, with anybody being able to publish anything on the internet, how do you discern what is factual and what may not be? What's your advice on that?
Good question. Uh-oh. Dr. Hess, did we lose you?
I think we may have. So.
Oh no. She's so smart. I don't want to lose you, Dr. Hess.
Let me see if we can reconnect her.
Okay. I think I'm going to start speaking to the question right now, and then I'll have a much more educated person on our line, hopefully in a moment, that can speak to it. It's called peer review, and one of the problems with peer review is that a lot of people think, well, it's everybody who drinks Kool-Aid. And I understand that perspective, but please also understand that research loves objectivity. Research, in fact, there can be resistance to assumptions of the norm. So think about things like brain plasticity, which was thought to never be the case. It didn't exist. And then a few professors started talking about it, and then they would get fired from their job for bringing it up. And now we know empirically that brain plasticity exists. And what that means is that there are new neurons. The brain rewires itself. And it was just always assumed that didn't happen. And think about when I was in high school, they're like, don't drink because it kills your brain cells and you're born with all the brain cells you ever have. And I'm, oh my goodness, that's very scary. I don't feel like I have many. So let's be very careful with how we're killing off brain cells. So what we're looking at here is, how do you make that make sense? This research makes sense and find validity. And we do that through peer research. So we have other people that are good at looking at your methodology, looking at your procedures, looking at the questions that you ask, and how you go about finding those answers. So, hey, Greg, if you we have Dr. Hess back. If you want to ask that question again and have a better response from somebody smarter than me, please let's address that.
I'd also like to apologize to the audience. The camera switched to me there for a minute as well. So so you got to see the man behind the curtain there as well. So Dr. Hess, the question was with the internet and anybody basically being able to publish information, how do you discern what is valid when you're looking at research and trying to understand what you really should believe in?
Right. Again, that gets us back to the word credibility. So look at who the author is. What are their credentials? That's the first place to start. Because if somebody is certified or licensed, then they have a scope of practice that they have to work within. They also have to keep up continuing education, which is important to that certification or licensure that they have. So that, to me, is the first step. Look at who the person is, what are their credentials, who are they certified or licensed through. Then also look at who they might be associated with. But in this day and age, that's less important to me, because a lot of people work freelance and they're highly credible. And so I would go back to looking at their credentials and who those credentials are from. Are they working within their scope of practice? So similar to what we were saying earlier, if we have somebody that's a certified personal trainer and they're talking to me about exercise protocols, I'm good with that. If they start talking to me about mental health or pain management, I become very skeptical very quickly.
Very good. Greg, do any other questions from our crew here?
Other than why they saw me, nobody, no other questions. That was it. So thank you for the answer to that one, Dr. Hess.
All right, Dr. Hess, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing it. So much knowledge and so much experience with the audience here from NASM. If they have questions for you, or they want to find you or follow you or reach out to you, if you're willing to do that, do you have any email address or social media platforms that you use?
I can always be found through CalU.edu. So I'm Hess_RA at CalU.edu. If you just Google Rebecca Hess, normally I will pop up, and I'm always welcome. I'm always talking to students from years and years ago, and seeing them when I'm out and about. And like you, Rick, I hope we get out and about here pretty soon.
Oh, amen.
Nonetheless, it's good to see everybody over Skype, and it's really good to see you.
Excellent. Dr. Hess, thank you so much, and thank you for everything that you did for me throughout my process and my education, and then upon graduation, how absolutely wonderful you were in person and with my family and my children. Thank you for everything that you've done. I really appreciate you, and I thank everybody for joining in and participating and listening to this. I hope you found it valuable, and I hope that NASM can continue to be a resource for you and your education, your continuing education, and we will continue to provide a platform for learning. My name is Rick Richey. This is the NASM CPT Podcast.